In 1675, the King of England looked at coffeehouses and decided they were a threat. Not because the coffee was bad, it probably was bad. Not because the foam art was politically radical. There was no foam art. Everyone was just drinking bitter mud and developing opinions. The king was worried because men were gathering in coffeehouses, reading the news, spreading rumors, criticizing the government, and generally acting like the comment section had become a physical location. So he tried to shut them down, which is a very dramatic reaction to bean water. But England was not the only place this happened. For hundreds of years, coffee was treated like a dangerous new vice. Religious authorities debated it, rulers feared it, satirists mocked it. Vendors were punished for selling it. Coffee was accused of corrupting bodies, minds, marriages, religion, social order, and occasionally the state. All of which feels insane now, because coffee is normal. Suspiciously normal. It sits in your kitchen like a domesticated demon. You scoop it into a machine. You press a button. The machine screams, spits out hot bean water, and this is considered a healthy adult ritual. People say things like, "Don't talk to me until I've had my coffee." And everyone just accepts that. Imagine saying that about soup. But coffee was not always normal. Coffee used to scare people, and not just because everyone was jittery and smelled like a roasted basement. Coffee scared people because it did something very dangerous. It gave ordinary people a reason to gather, stay awake, talk too much, share rumors, question authority, and come back tomorrow to do it again. And historically, rulers have not loved that. So how does a plant go from strange berry to threat to public order? The answer is not really coffee. The answer is people. And people, unfortunately, love gathering in rooms and saying things. Coffee's roots are usually traced back to Ethiopia, where wild coffee plants grew and where legends say people first noticed the berries had a strange, energizing effect. You've probably heard the goat story. A goat herder named Kaldi supposedly noticed his goats eating coffee berries and then bouncing around like they had been possessed by tiny productivity goblins. This is a legend, which means we should treat it carefully. But I do love it, because the oldest coffee story being the goats started acting weird feels spiritually correct. There is something very believable about humanity discovering caffeine by looking at a goat and thinking, that animal knows something. Across the Red Sea in Yemen, coffee starts becoming something closer to the drink we recognize. By the 1400s, Sufi communities were using coffee to stay awake through long nights of prayer, which is an incredible early job for coffee. Before coffee was for spreadsheets, it was for God. Coffee's early resume is wild. First, it helped religious mystics stay awake for prayer. Before long, it was accused of destabilizing cities, a concerning trajectory for a beverage. At this point, coffee was useful. It helped people stay awake. It supported ritual. It became part of religious and social life. But coffee has never been just a drink. Coffee is a behavior. It's a tiny ceremony. You don't simply consume coffee. You arrange yourself around it. You sit, you sip, you linger. You stare into the middle distance and become slightly more convinced that your thoughts matter. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. Because coffee does not stay quietly in prayer circles forever. It escapes. It moves into streets, markets, shops, and public life. People start gathering around it. They build rooms for it. And once humans build a room for something, you have to start worrying. A cup of coffee in one person's hand is harmless. A room full of coffee drinkers is different. That's not a beverage anymore. That's infrastructure. Coffeehouses became places where people heard news, traded gossip, played games, listened to poetry, made deals, argued politics, mocked officials, complained about prices, complained about leaders, complained about each other, and probably complained about the coffee. In other words, coffee created the internet before the internet. Except instead of logging on, you walked into a smoky room, paid for a cup of bitter mud, and listened to a man explain why the empire was doomed. Then another man would say, Actually, my cousin's barber heard the real problem is the vizier. And now the room is on fire emotionally. And once ordinary people started gathering to compare thoughts, authorities noticed. One of the earliest major coffee panics happened in Mecca in 1511. Picture the scene. A vendor is selling coffee. People are drinking it, talking, lingering too long, and enjoying themselves far too much. Then, the authorities decide this has gone far enough. Coffee is seized. Coffee is burned. Vendors and some customers are punished. Traders stop bringing coffee into the city. Imagine being dragged into trouble because you wanted the forbidden bean sludge. Imagine standing there while someone burns your coffee and calls it public safety. The official argument was religious. Was coffee intoxicating? Did it alter the mind? If coffee changed how you felt, did that make it forbidden? And to be fair, coffee absolutely changes how you feel. It can transform a person from barely functioning zombie into, I have identified 7 problems with the state. But the deeper fear was not just caffeine. It was the gathering. Authorities were not only looking at the cup, they were looking at the room, the gossip, the games, the arguments, the people questioning things they were supposed to politely not question. Coffee was the excuse. The coffee house was the crime scene. And this pattern keeps repeating. In the Ottoman world, coffee houses became woven into public life. They were social spaces, performance spaces, neighborhood spaces, political spaces, places where men gathered to drink, smoke, listen, argue, and say things that became dangerous when repeated later. Which is basically humanity's favorite hobby. First, we discovered fire and gathered around it to complain. Then we discovered coffee and complained with better posture. Some Ottoman coffee houses became politically important. Janissaries, the powerful military corps of the Ottoman Empire, used coffee houses as meeting places. Some functioned like unofficial headquarters. And in 1730, the revolt of Patrona Halil, which helped bring down Sultan Ahmed III, began in a coffee house. Rulers were not just afraid of coffee. They were afraid of what formed around it. Networks, rumor machines, unofficial newsrooms, little temples of caffeine and treason-adjacent conversation. Coffee had become a kind of social technology, a reliable excuse for strangers to become regulars, regulars to become groups, and groups to become problems. A government can control an official meeting. It can monitor a court. It can punish a speech. But 100 smoky rooms full of awake people muttering into cups? That is harder. No one in power wants to hear that a beverage has developed a constituency. Which brings us back to England. When coffee houses spread through London in the 1600s, they became wildly popular. Men gathered there to read newspapers, debate politics, make business deals, and talk endlessly. They were sometimes called penny universities because for the price of a cup of coffee, you could sit inside and absorb information from everyone around you. Which sounds charming, unless you are a king. Because from a king's perspective, a penny university is just a discount rebellion incubator. So in 1675, King Charles II tried to suppress coffee houses. And his complaint was not subtle. He said coffee houses attracted idle and disaffected persons. That phrase is perfect. Idle and disaffected persons. That is such a royal way to say, the vibes in there are rancid, and I do not trust these little freaks. He also complained that coffee houses were spreading false, malicious, and scandalous reports about the government. Translation: people were talking about the king in rooms where the king wasn't invited. And that's when someone in a palace starts sweating into a velvet collar. You can almost see him receiving the reports. Some exhausted royal official walks in, bows, and says, "Your Majesty, unfortunately, the men with tiny cups are being weird again." And Charles says, "What are they saying?" And the official says, "Things." What kind of things? Disaffected things. And just like that, coffee had become a national security concern. Not because it made people drunk, but because it did almost the opposite. It made people sober, alert. annoyingly present. In a tavern, people could drink themselves into nonsense. But in a coffeehouse, people read. They listened. They remembered names. They connected events. They left with ideas. Authorities were used to drunk people being a problem. Coffee created something worse: sober people with opinions. Of course, not every complaint about coffee was political. Some people just thought coffee culture was unbearable, which is also valid. In 1674, a satirical pamphlet called The Women's Petition Against Coffee mocked coffee as a newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor. Heathenish liquor? That is an incredible insult. It sounds like either a moral panic or a limited edition seasonal roast. The pamphlet complained that men were wasting time in coffeehouses, neglecting their wives, and drinking what it dismissed as muddy water. And you know what? Rude, but fair. Coffee people have always been a problem. The costumes change, but the curse remains. In the 1600s, it was men in coffeehouses, loudly debating politics over sludgy water. Now, it's a man in a beanie, explaining that your grinder is ruining the spiritual potential of a Guatemalan bean named Sebastian. Civilization advances. The bean remains cursed. But that is also why coffee endured. It attached itself to a human habit that is almost impossible to outlaw: gathering. You can ban a product. It's much harder to ban a social habit that makes people feel awake, connected, informed, and slightly superior. Humans already wanted places to gather, rumors to trade, and rituals to return to. Coffee just showed up and asked, what if you were awake for it? That was the real threat. Not that coffee was magical, not that it was evil, not that the beans were whispering revolutionary slogans from inside the sack. Probably not, anyway. Coffeehouses turned a bunch of separate complainers into something much harder to control: a public. A public with news. A public with opinions. A public with caffeine. And that is a terrible combination if your job depends on everyone staying quiet. So the next time you make coffee, remember what you're really doing. You're not just making a beverage. You are participating in a centuries-old tradition of bitter liquid, public gathering, gossip, ritual, insomnia, mild superiority, and governments quietly wondering if everyone needs to calm down. Coffee wasn't powerful because of what was in the cup. It was powerful because of what formed around it. It gave people a table. And once people had a table, they started talking, which is always where the trouble begins. Still curious? Choose another strange thing before the sack opens. Like and subscribe.